As the Dormouse began telling the story, Alice kept interrupting with questions. The Hatter scolded Alice, and she became angry. Eventually, in frustration, Alice left what she considered the worst tea party ever as she once again entered the long hall, picked up the tiny golden key, and opened the door to the garden, walking in. Near the entrance of the garden stood a large rose tree with white roses. And 3 gardeners were busy trying to paint the white roses red. Alice found this quite peculiar and walked over to see what was going on. As she approached them, one of the gardeners said, "Watch yourself, 5. Don't splatter paint on me like that." 5 angrily responded, "It's not my fault, it's 7 who bumped my arm." At this point, 7 raised his head and said, "Oh, stop blaming me, 5. You always shift the blame onto others." 5 said, "You'd better not say much more. I heard the Queen say yesterday that you deserve to lose your head." The first gardener asked, "Why?" 7 replied, "It's none of your business." 2, 5 added, "It's not his concern, but I'll tell him. It's because you gave the onions to the cook instead of the irises." 7 threw down his brush and said, "Well, if we're talking about unfairness." Suddenly, he noticed Alice. She was standing there, watching them. Without saying anything, the other 2 also turned to look. Then all 3 of them bowed deeply. Alice, feeling timid, said, "Could you please tell me why you're painting the roses?" Both 5 and 7 looked at 2, and 2 spoke softly, "Oh, miss, you see, we were supposed to plant red roses here, but we mistakenly planted white ones. If the Queen finds out, we'll all lose our heads. So, miss, you see, we're doing our best to paint the roses red before the Queen arrives." At that moment, the anxious 5 suddenly shouted, "The Queen! The Queen!" The 3 gardeners immediately dropped to the ground, their faces in the dirt. Then came the sound of many footsteps, and Alice eagerly looked to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs, all looking much like the 3 gardeners, rectangular with hands and feet at the 4 corners. Following them were 10 courtiers, all adorned with diamonds, much like the soldiers, walking in pairs. The courtiers were followed by the royal children, adorable little creatures holding hands and happily skipping along, all adorned with red hearts. Alice noticed that the hearts and the diamonds of the courtiers, as well as the clubs of the soldiers, were the 3 suits of playing cards. Behind them came the guests, mostly the King and Queen themselves. Among the guests, Alice recognized the White Rabbit, who was frantically and nervously speaking, nodding and smiling at others but not noticing Alice. Following them was a Knave of Hearts, holding the King's crown with both hands on a crimson cushion. This vast procession was followed by the Red King and Queen themselves. Alice didn't know whether she should follow the 3 gardeners' example and lie face down on the ground, as she couldn't recall this protocol being followed when the procession passed by. Who would see them that way? What was the point of this procession? She pondered these thoughts as she stood waiting. When the procession reached Alice, they all came to a stop and stared at her. The Queen sternly asked the Knave of Hearts, "Who is this?" The Knave of Hearts simply bowed and smiled in response. "Fool," the Queen said impatiently, shaking her head. Then she turned to Alice and asked, "What's your name, child?" "I'm Alice, Your Majesty," Alice replied politely, but then she couldn't help but mutter to herself, "Really? They're just a deck of cards. There's no need to be afraid of them. But who are they, anyway? The queen pointed to the 3 gardeners and asked, "What about these 3 gardeners, who are they?" The Queen of Hearts pointed at the 3 gardeners who were still lying face down on the ground. Alice responded, surprising herself with her bravery, "Oh, they're just gardeners. Why, they're not anyone important, just some gardeners." The Queen's face turned red, and she glared at Alice like a wild animal for a moment, then screeched angrily, "Off with their heads! Off with them, nonsense!" Alice boldly exclaimed, while the Queen fell silent. The King gently tugged on the Queen's arm and whispered softly, "Calm down, my dear. She's just a child." The Queen turned away from the King and said to the soldier, "Turn them over with your feet." The soldier carefully flipped all 3 of them over with his foot.